A Midwesterner that may be happy to try to live up to. My name is Ted Franz, and I'm a professor of history at the University of Indianapolis. It's my pleasure to primarily serve as traffic cop with three outstanding graduate students who are going to help redefine our idea of the Midwest and Midwestern history by contributing to the Academy for years to come. Collectively, we agreed that the first plenary session might not have the last word when it came on the political history of, or they are interpreting 2016. I think the three gentlemen to my left might have some different interpretations than what we heard this morning. In this room, we are probably all coming to grips, no matter what your politics, with the results of last November. Depending on the place that you call home, the results of the election were either stunning or downright earth-shattering. But we know that, regardless of interpretation, that 2016 made it clear to the nation that seemed otherwise willing to forget the Midwest, that the Midwest has always mattered and should always matter as a path to electoral success for any candidate who wants to be successful, right? Those of us who know this region as our own home, we've always known that it matters politically, and so maybe 2016 just underscored that which we already knew. But what does it mean to talk about the Midwestern politics with any kind of sophistication? With anything beyond just banal generalities that we heard for the first month or so immediately after the election. With me today are three, as I said, emerging scholars of varieties of Midwestern politics. And so in particular, their specialties include Latino communities, the far right, and the role that down ballot elections have made and played in Midwestern political practice, which makes things far more nuanced than many outsiders would realize. So I'm going to do a quick introduction and then just turn it over for some questions. I think this will be pretty free-flowing. And we certainly want to make sure there's a lot of audience interaction. So from my left to my right, first on the end here we have Sergio Gonzalez, who's a doctoral candidate in the Department of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a 2016-17 Marquette University Arnold L. Mitchum Fellow. His dissertation is centered on working class and immigration history, entitled "I Was a Stranger and You Welcomed Me: Latino Immigration, Religion, and Community Formation in Milwaukee, 1920 to 1999. It examines the religious communities Latino immigrants developed in Wisconsin throughout the 20th century. Because he doesn't have enough on his plate, he is also currently completing a book manuscript entitled Mexicans in Wisconsin with the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. And he's actively involved in a number of community organizations throughout Wisconsin, as well as the co-president of the Teaching Assistants Association in Madison. To his right is Corey Holla, right? Corey, doctoral candidate in the Department of History at Marquette University. You begin to see a Wisconsin-based theme here, perhaps. There he studies the modern Midwest with a focus on the history of liberalism and the legacy of the 20th century progressivism. His dissertation, tentatively entitled Midwestern Liberalism in the Age of Reagan, 1978 to 1992, explores how liberal grassroots associations retooled their electoral and organizational strategies to adapt to the political, economic, and social changes of the Reagan Revolution. Finally, to my immediate left is Matt Ryder, who is a doctoral candidate in the Department of History at UW-Madison, specializing in labor history and the history of American conservatism. His dissertation examines long-term political organizing among Midwestern industrialists across the 20th century, specifically their successful fusion of financial and political capital with regional populist sentiments. Also a member of the Teaching Assistants Association and a member of a number of different communities throughout Wisconsin as well. So that's those are the experts, and it's a real treat for me as a professor to learn from them and their expertise. And so I thought for the first question, throw it out this way. When you're a graduate student toiling away in obscurity, or at least feeling underappreciated at times, whether or not you were welcomed the results of the November election, or were recoiling at those results, you certainly had this moment where, rather than having to explain to others why you were doing what you're doing, where you realized that what you were engaged in doing could actually explain something that mattered deeply to a lot of people who weren't immediately related to you, or forced to listen to you talk about your dissertation, right? And that is a great feeling. Like, what I do actually matters. So how does your work inform the way that you interpreted the results of the election of 2016? Sergio, if you want to start, you can just go from there.
So, thank you for that opening question. There's I think a few different ways that I'd like to approach that. First of all, I'd say that while I appreciate being on the panel, I'm not a political historian by definition, but everything that I study has to do with political power, political mobilization. So I'd like to talk about two quick things. The first thing has to do with how the Latino vote was interpreted after the 2016 election. Immediately following the results, the predominant theme or the predominant idea was that the Latino vote had actually turned out in larger numbers for the Trump campaign than it had for the Clinton campaign. So within the first few days, the narrative was that Trump had won 30% of the Latino vote. Everyone was shocked. They said, I thought the fact that he was anti-immigrant, that he had said these things about Mexican immigrants, would have colored the way that people understood his campaign and also his potential presidency. Latino Decisions, which other than the Pew Hispanic poll is probably the most reputable polling firm that actually studies Latinos in the United States, came out with a rejoinder in a few days after the election and said that those assessments were dramatically overstated. In fact, instead of 30%, it was closer to 20%, which fell in line within the previous two Obama wins in 2008 and 2012. But the thing I want to point out within those numbers is that there are distinct differences when you look at regionality. So in Florida, if you look at the Florida numbers, the Clinton campaign was only able to garner 67% of the Latino vote, 67%. And the reason there, of course, is because of the large Cuban population. So Cubans turned out actually 52% of Cubans in Florida voted for the Trump campaign. If we shift the focus over to Wisconsin, what we saw is actually 87% of Latinos actually voted for the Clinton campaign, and within that, 90% of Mexican descent voters voted for the Clinton campaign. So the reason I kind of draw this out here is to discuss the importance of breaking down these monolithic categories when we talk about voting groups. So the Latino vote is a much more complex, diverse, and varied group than is portrayed not just in the media, but is also understood by political campaigns. And my research, which looks at the Latino community or Latino communities, to say more succinctly, across Wisconsin, helps to kind of complicate that. My research starts with the arrival of Mexican migrant or Mexican descent workers in the 1920s, but I quickly move into Puerto Rican migrants and Cuban refugees arriving in the 50s and 60s, and I end my dissertation with the arrival of Central American refugees fleeing destruction and civil war in their home region. And the reason I do that is because to understand the Midwest is to really understand a Latino community that is more diverse than we understand in the U.S. Southwest or in New York or in Miami. And so I think I want to leave it there before jumping into some other topics.
Great. Corey.
So, and again, thank you as well. And really excited to be here. One of the things that I look at in my dissertation on Midwestern liberalism is this idea that perhaps the most common one, especially now, is the Midwest was liberal once. Is a question that I get asked, and I say, yeah, it was, and it was in my lifetime as well. When you had a large number of Midwestern voters, not only at the presidential level, right? We can look at electoral maps from the 1980s, from 1984 being the big exception, all the way to the modern day, 2016 being the exception, where you see the Midwest as blue. You look at Minnesota, you look at Wisconsin, you look at Iowa, Illinois stands out. These are blue states. And that down ballot, these are blue states as well. That there are Democrats at the local and at the statewide level that are winning election to these certain posts, where otherwise we haven't considered them before. And that when we talk about new Democrats, so Clinton being the one that comes to mind most of all, new Democrats and this kind of new Democratic coalition comes in part out of the Midwest. That there are these moderate Democrats, or that there are Democrats who kind of buck the national trend emerging from the Midwest. That there is a regional Midwestern identity. And I seek to find that in my research, and I think we found it so far. And what I'd like to highlight, and we'll get into more when we, when I have some fancy, fun, colorful maps up here to play with today too, that there are still some of these Democrats, these holdovers from the 1980s and 1990s, still sticking around in the Midwest. And it's important to look down ballot for where liberalism and where Democrats have, again, broken those monoliths that Sergio talks about. And the biggest one of those being this idea of the rural-urban binary, right? We do. God knows I've read probably 30, 40 just awful think pieces where, oh yeah, rural went conservative, urban went liberal, and that's it. No need to explore it any further. We'll look at it in a little bit. The precinct by precinct map of Minnesota is the example I'm using here in the 2016 election to show there is tremendous deviation, rural versus urban, on just simple issues of did you vote for Colin Peterson, the U.S. representative from Minnesota in the Northwestern 7th District. Did you vote for Colin Peterson? Did you vote for Hillary Clinton? We're talking precincts with 40 to 50% deviation, that they voted for one and not the other. So there's an importance to looking at this down ballot because it does break down one of the rural-urban binaries that we talk about so much. But it also forces us to focus a little bit on the suburbs. What are people doing in these growing suburban and exurban areas? How are they voting? What political groups are present there? Are they voting for third parties? And it forces us to kind of reach out and analyze what's going on there. And finally, the last thing I'd say is one of the figures, the reason I originally went to 1990 in my dissertation, and I'm extending to 1992 because it allows me to reach backwards and grab Russ Feingold of Wisconsin into that. And so we'll look at Russ's defeat in both 2010 and 2016, but his defeat in 2016 shows the electoral profile of Wisconsin has changed substantially in 24 years, and I think it's really important to suss that out a little bit and explore how the Democratic Party might have lost its grip on some areas of Wisconsin and of the Midwest that traditionally have voted Democrat.
Thank you. Yeah, just sort of piggyback off what Corey said. I actually got to Madison in 2011. Which you all know, which a lot of people know, understood, is a time of uprising, a little turmoil. And so the question really became, for a lot of people, is how did a state so associated with progressivism, with like the Follett school, of thought, progressivism, how did this become this laboratory for real conservative ideas in a very red conservative Assembly and Senate and gubernatorial branch? So I've been working on this since 2011, and so it sort of connects to the present with the Trump election. So a historian of American conservatism in the New York Times this April actually had this to say about the field of the history of conservatism in the 20th century. You can just quote him for a second. The professional guardians of America's past have made a mistake. We've advanced the narrative of the American right that was far too constricted to anticipate the rise of a man like Trump. Future historians won't be able to find much of a foundation for Trumpism in the essays of William F. Buckley, the scrupulous constitutionalist principles of Barry Goldwater, or the bright-eyed optimism of Ronald Reagan. And I think he's a little too hard on American conservative historians. I think they do sort of get into the far right. But he's right for the most part. We have the political mobilization of the Southwest and the South. We have the economic, the closest it comes to the Midwest is really the deindustrialization and racial resentment out of this deindustrialization. And then ideologically, we have Buckley's National Review as a mode of fusionism, as it's called, of libertarian and traditionalist thought. This doesn't explain how a guy like Alex Jones, who runs the InfoWars network and President Trump has been a regular guest, can say William F. Buckley was a CIA agent. the National Review was created by the CAA to destroy the conservative movement of the 20th century. I mean, these are two it's a conspiratorial thought. So we have to come to grips with this conspiracy theory among the far right, the fringe right. So I think the Midwestern view of how political and business activism grew in this region can lend us to that. And they started mobilizing against the La Follette progressives and then later New Deal reforms. And this is sort of adds to the idea that there was a regional significance of the Midwest because there was a fissure among industrialists between the East Coast and the Midwest. The East Coast industrialists went along, for the most part, with stipulations of labor regulations in the New Deal. The Midwest, because of the nature of their business, there was low overhead. They were family run for the most part. They were very labor intensive, so there was a high turnover with labor relations. They just could not adhere and make a profit with a lot of the New Deal regulations. So we see this thread of a virulent anti-unionism come out of the Midwest that gets adopted by the East Coast eventually through Lemuel Boulware, who's the General Electric labor management CEO, Boulwareism as it's called. And then this idea, this globalist vision, I guess, of that Alex Jones talks about, this anti-internationalism, this idea that we cannot trust the Eastern corporations that are publicly shared. We cannot trust, as one industrialist put it, the effete Eastern attitude to guard the Midwest like true American torchbearers of what it is to be an American businessman against these forces out east that are corrupting America, including business. So I'll skip ahead. Sorry, I'm going so long. It's all right. Okay. So post-1952 GOP convention, these fringe rights are sort of kicked out of the Republican Party, and they sort of go into single issues. In fact, McCarthy's second term, when the Red Scare, when red baiting is going down, decreasing as a political currency, he goes into anti-United Nations rhetoric. We see the growth of like the Committee Against Foreign Entanglements, which becomes a group that the John Birch Society later uses to pull out members. And we see mobilization against the Kohler strike, UAW, and also in Wisconsin, actually. So basically, I'll stop there. Sorry, I'm going on too long. But we see this a development inside and outside the party of the fringe right impacting American politics.
Okay. A lot to hang our hats on already, and we've got more questions that could generate, I think, time to go till about 8 p.m. at minimum. We won't do that to you. Again, in conversations that we've had prior to this event, and certainly since we got here this morning, another one that we thought of. When you think of a Midwestern voter, what do you think of? Because I think each of you has a different idea of what it means to be a Midwestern voter, and that might not be the same thing that the people writing columns in early November were writing about. So when you all think of a Midwestern voter, who do you think of and why? And actually, we'll go back this way. So. Yeah.
So I think a Midwestern voter is someone that votes along, along what's their income, their personal income, material, pocketbook issues. I think there's a long history of this that you can see. Even there's David Thalen, who's a University of Wisconsin historian, looked at even mobilization around La Follette and during the Progressive era. It was more about what he was doing for personal issues, for personal gain among voters, that actually led to the mobilization that led to the coalition needed to get the progressives elected. I think we see this along the farmers, all along through the 20th century. I think we see pocketbook issues really driving the Midwestern voter, and I don't think there's any. Well, I'm sure we can talk more about other resentments later, but yeah.
Okay. So pocketbook. This is the main thing for you. Okay.
So the word that I guess to take away is a ticket splitter, is when I look at the Midwest what I see. So I come from a state, Minnesota, where since I was born, in 1990, Yeah, no, for real. Yeah, since I was born in 1990, again, I'm sorry, we've elected a moderate conservative who is relatively liberal on social issues. We've elected a straight line Republican. We've elected a very, very progressive but wealthy Democrat. We've also elected a pro wrestler. So Minnesotans are electorally all over the map, and you see this around the Midwest, and you see it again to this day. You can get people who, and it might be on pocketbook issues, who will vote at the same time for a progressive Democrat as they will for a moderate or conservative Republican. There's crossover that happens in big ways. You don't see quite the straight line party vote in the Midwest. I argue that you do elsewhere.
So I'll tell you what we don't think of a Midwestern voter, and that is not Latino. So I think we still exist within the black-white binary, and I think when we talk about the Midwest, the story that was told about Midwestern voters was about black voters didn't turn out enough, or white voters switched their allegiances, but we never talk about Latino voters. But some numbers on Wisconsin. So Wisconsin's Latino population is over 400,000. And that has grown, I can give you some numbers. In 1990, it was 2% of the state population. In 2000, it was 3.5% of the state population. In 2013, it was 6.3% of the population. Now it's over 7% of the population. That population, the median age is approximately half of the non-Latino population. Half, right? So this is a young population. And we can also not assume that this is a population that is all dealing with documentation status problems, because more than 1/2 of Latino residents born in the 9 major counties of Wisconsin were actually born within the United States, right? And that's not accounting for Latinos who have naturalized and also have the ability to vote. Those are not stories that are told when we talk about the Midwestern voter. Latinos in states like Wisconsin, and Illinois, Michigan, and Minnesota are growing exponentially. And I think when we focus on Latino voters, we talk about the Southwest and New York and Florida, and eventually the Midwest is going to have to enter that conversation as well.
And I think that dovetails nicely to what we would follow up with, which are looking within the states, rather than just looking them on the macro or looking at the region as a whole. You start looking within the states. How does that help us better understand, more accurately understand the socio-political culture of the Midwest? So getting down on a more grassroots level. Start with you, Corey, in the middle, I guess.
Well, I think I'm going to use my fancy graphic gun at this point, since I've been hyping it up, and I'm sorry to disappoint you all when I actually turn it on. But especially if it doesn't work. So if you're one of those people who's inclined to use like your own personal electronic devices, you go through this, you can just go to my name, CoreyHolla.org, and it's the first post right there. Hopefully this works. So what this is a map of the Minnesota congressional election by precinct. So that's all. I blocked them out, I think, nicely in whatever color that is. I'm actually colorblind, so when I play with these colorful maps, I have no clue what the hell's going on. So you can tell me that like what I'm talking when I say blue, that's actually like bright purple or something, and we'll talk about it later. But what you have here is you have a map of, and I've shaded them based on who they elected, the red obviously for Republican, blue for Democrat, showing how they voted in this election, taking the percentage of their vote for the Democratic candidate for the congressional election, subtract and taking away their vote for Hillary in the presidential election. And so the lighter a county is, again, bear with me, this is a lot of math and I haven't taken a class in like 6-7 years. The lighter a county is, the greater that divide is. So the more people who crossed over and voted for a Democratic congressional candidate, but for Trump in the general election. So you see here, it stands out, the Northwest, I guess the Western half-third of the state that Colin Peterson represents. If we were to just click on any of these little groups here, you see it pops out. I guess there's no way of zooming in beyond that, but it says Fisher Township, and this is just some random locale, but 55.8% round your numbers, Corey. 55.8% voting for Colin Peterson, 10.3% voting for Hillary Clinton in the election. These are not insignificant margins of difference. Okay, and so this congressional district ends up going to Trump by about 30 points. We don't talk enough about people like Colin Peterson, and I argue that there needs to be a better historical approach to doing that. The Washington Post just published something. Wow, did you know that Colin Peterson is a dying breed, this rural Democrat? My answer is, hell yeah, I did. I'm studying this guy. We need to talk more about him. But then it's not just Colin Peterson. You look at these other regions, the southern half of the state, traditionally, again, conservative section of Minnesota, one that in demographic and economic profile rivals somebody like South Dakota or like Iowa. A lot of family farming still persists in that region. But you again see there's this crossover. It's not as large, but again, you can pull up some of these places and see 10-point swings for Tim Walz, who's eyeing a gubernatorial run in Minnesota in 2018. 10-point swing for him versus Hillary. So these are significant. Where are these rural Democrats, and how might the Democratic Party consider in the future? How might we run or identify candidates who look like this? And for the Republican Party, to the opposite side, so that we can be fair and balanced, I think is the phrase I'm supposed to use. My own district, who elected, and I will editorialize here, who elected Trump Jr., a guy who made his name being America's Mr. Right on conservative talk radio, is now apparently the man representing me in Congress. I'm not wild about that. I also didn't like the Democrat though, so that's how it goes. But you look at, and John Lauck has identified in his essay on the 2016 election in the Midwest, the fact that there was a suburban crossover vote for Hillary, right? I'm not misreading that? Thank God. Okay, so there is a suburban crossover vote for Hillary, but at the same time, it was not enough in counties like this to tip the scales in favor of the Democratic congressional candidate. So this again becomes a question that for Democratic and Republican parties alike, if Republicans want to win this district, or at least turn out more Republican voters in this suburban district, which was a Republican hold, retiring John Klein gave way to Jason Lewis, but it's a distinct swing at how conservative you are. How might the Republican Party better solidify their hold on that region? For the Democrats as well, they still won. Hillary won this district. But how might they better turn out a candidate that wins this congressional district as well? Because this is only, we're talking all of these districts. The ones that I've identified are R or D plus 1 or 2 in their Cook rate. These are not places that have some huge ideological swing. And this is replicable in places around the Midwest, and I've gone on way too long, so I'm going to leave it there. But this idea to come back to what Ted was asking about, because I've forgotten the question at this point too, so sorry.
No, you're talking about looking within a state, which
yes.
You were looking within a state.
Thank God.
Pretty granular.
I guess I was the dumb ballot guy, so yeah.
Right, and that's what you wanted to do. So again, looking within a state. Matt, you want to?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Not at that granular level, but political organizing, I think, in Wisconsin. I think that we need to talk about that. Obama in the postmortem in the New York Times talked about how he was kind of shocked that Hillary never once set foot in Wisconsin. We've all heard this. She did not campaign at all in such an important swing state, especially the counties that swung right along the Mississippi River, right? That borderline, that word Minnesota. Those all went to Trump, where in the past 4 years ago, those all went to Obama. And so there's a long history of getting voter turnout, using the historical context of the GOP in Wisconsin. They set up a precinct program because they operate under the assumption that Wisconsin was inherently more conservative as a population than the Progressive Party was pulling out. And they thought if they could get voters, increasing voters turnout in these precincts and spread the organizing around the state, that would be their goal of victory. So I think the Wisconsin Democratic Party just met last week, and they sort of switched roles now. They are actually talking about setting up a precinct program around the state and copying what the Republican Party did to beat the progressives in the early part of the 20th century. So I think it comes down to just getting out, setting up volunteers and voter turnout, and just focusing on issues that will get voters to the ballot box. And what those are, we can talk about more. Yeah.
It's worth it. Sorry. It's worth noting that in these downstate races as well, especially in western Wisconsin, replace Rebel, I don't remember who won. In these western Wisconsin races, the third and the 8th, in the third, which is a big swath of west central Wisconsin, stretching all the way to the Minnesota border, the Democrat Ron Kind ran unopposed, which the Republican chair of the 3rd district was talking about how embarrassed he was that he couldn't even field a candidate. But that might have as well depressed Democratic voter turnout. But it's to the point that, you know, running up the score matters. It matters in Milwaukee, and it matters in these rural areas. And Republicans in some of these areas that Matt's talking about were really, really good at running up the score on Hillary.
So, I mean, I'll shift this a little bit here and talk about what looking at a state helps us understand about moving forward. And one of the things, as a Latino historian, that I'm trying to historicize when I have these conversations is this question of nativism that was inherently part of the Trump campaign. I mean, when he came down the escalator, one of the first things he talked about was Mexican immigrants and the fact that they're rapists, they're criminals, but some of them are good guys, right? So the question I'm trying to understand is how long that platform can last within the Republican Party. And I think looking at places like Wisconsin is a way to break that down. Last February, Republican legislators in the Wisconsin State House proposed 2 anti-immigrant bills. One of them is what we popularly known as anti-sanctuary city bills. The idea that the state will penalize municipalities that disempower their employees and law enforcement from working with Immigration and Customs Enforcement as arms of Immigration and Customs. And because of those proposed bills, Voces de la Frontera, which is the preeminent immigrant rights organization in Wisconsin, brought 20,000 immigrants and allies to the state capitol and shut down those bills. And that was kind of the popular story of it. But behind the scenes, one of the reasons that bill failed was because of the dairy producers in the state. In Wisconsin, obviously Wisconsin known as the dairy state, anywhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of the labor force for the dairy industry are undocumented Mexican descent workers, right? So the dairy industry, which in almost every other aspect of their voting record would probably agree with conservative, if not aspects of the Trump platform, found this abhorrent, economically speaking, right? So that bill was defeated. That bill came up once again last week. So it was introduced again by conservative legislators in the Wisconsin State House. And what will be interesting to see will be if that bill will actually get to the governor's desk this time around. Last year it floundered in the Assembly. It passed the Assembly, it floundered in the Senate, never made it to the governor's desk. And after Texas passed an anti-sanctuary city bill just a few weeks ago, it'll be interesting to see if Wisconsin will follow that same path, or if the economic argument will kind of butt up again once again this nativist anti-immigrant argument.
Both of you, the last 2 comments kind of hinted at this. But one thing that Republicans have done nationwide far better than Democrats, but I would say particularly in the Midwest, is organizing, right? I come from Indianapolis, where a legendary organizer by the name of Keith Bulin helped make a city that otherwise should have been Democratic, Republican for 40 years in an urban area, right? And it's not a name that anybody knows outside of political circles. But it really was a machine, was modeled on Abraham Lincoln, of know who your voters are, where they are, be in touch with them, and get them to the polls, right? And this was incredibly successful. So why has it proven to be so difficult, do you think, based on your research and expertise, for Democrats to organize within the states of the Midwest?
I'll take that one. The Wisconsin Democratic Party, the DPW, is in really just disarray. They are rudderless. They have 2 chairs that the competition between 2 chairs was, that last week were 2 people that no one really wanted, and I think a lot of that has started since Act 10 was initiated in 2011, and you saw this trend of just the conservative, the Republican governor, Senate, and Assembly have just run roughshod. Right to Work came in. All these things have really, really, really weakened the Democrats' #1 supporter, obviously, unions. So how they're trying to figure out a way right now how to get back on track. The plan was that they were going to hold out hope for the 2020 census to come out, and so they could redistrict and overturn some of the gerrymandering issues that are going on in the state right now. That was their plan. It's looking like there's not going to be enough liberal judges to make that happen. So they're really, I mean, in my opinion, we're looking at 100 years of Republican rule in Wisconsin. I don't see where the Democrats have a real shot. Sorry for the pessimistic viewpoint.
We're optimistic, depending on right.
So Matt and I both serve as the co-presidents of the Teaching Assistants Association, which is one of the hallmark unions in the state of Wisconsin, the oldest graduate worker union in the country. And we saw that within our own union.
Yeah,
I mean, the coordinated attack on public sector unions first and then private sector unions after that had its intended effect and then some. I forgot to look up the numbers of public and private sector unions, but most public sector unions decertified within the few years at the end of their contracts, which means they dismantled their capacity to draw dues from their members, and which then hurts their capacity to do political work on behalf of candidates. And so in places like Milwaukee and Madison, but also in areas all across the state, those public and private sector unions that were, regardless of the relationship which had grown, I think, very strained between organized labor and the Democratic Party over the last few years, the one thing that they were still consistent on was political campaigning and being a political arm, putting boots on the ground to actually knock on doors for elections. That's been gone for the last 6 years.
It's worth noting, too, in terms of divisions within the Democratic Party that have kind of stunted some of this organizing. The profiles of Milwaukee, and given not really burying the lead there, the profiles of both Wisconsin and Minnesota are ones that they have both strong urban and strong rural constituencies, which is something within the Midwest where, in Illinois, Chicago is by and large enough to overcome the understanding of Bruce Rauner as their governor. So there goes that argument. But with some of the other states that we consider as well, the Dakotas, Iowa, places that lack a large metropolitan area. No offense to Sioux Falls, John. Places that lack really one of those large metropolitan areas. Democrats in those states need to be cognizant and need to be inclusive of both the rural and the urban interests. You see this in the name of Minnesota's Democratic Party. It is the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, and I know there are people who, after I use 1986 as my benchmark, there are rural advocates who say, well, you're the Democratic Labor Party now, and that's just fine, but the farmers would like to be included once again in the decision-making process within these parties. And to historicize it a little bit more and then shut up, and also to come to the AIG Midwestern crossover tomorrow when we talk about the farm crisis, because I'll be giving this same answer virtually, only in 15-minute form, if I haven't already reached that. There is a moment in the 1986 primaries in both Minnesota and Wisconsin for the gubernatorial and for the senatorial elections, where you see the rural and the urban butt up against one another. There's an increased hierarchy of urban elites in the Wisconsin Democratic Party. Thinking about Matt Flynn, who eventually runs for the senatorial post, and Ed Garvey, the former labor union rep of the NFL Players Union, who runs for Senate against Bob Castor, a very, very weak incumbent. They effectively failed to win the rural vote. And it's in part because the rural interests within the Wisconsin Democratic Party do not feel adequately represented. There's still that issue in Minnesota, but Minnesota has some of these candidates like Colin Peterson still fighting to make his name. Tim Penny, who's actually left the Democratic Party since then in Minnesota. Tim Penny is a relatively popular Democratic congressman from that southern half of the state that I showed earlier. So there are these rural-urban, these rural-urban kind of tensions within the parties that have only become exacerbated, I argue, since the early to mid-1980s.
Can I just jump in there?
Yeah. Roundtable.
Okay.
Point. That's the point.
So I also want to say, I also want to emphasize the strength of the right in understanding how important it is to win these state elections. And as the conservative organizer Paul Ehrlich once said, he quoted Chairman Mao by saying, "If you win the countryside, the capital will fall on its own." And that's the strategy he used to take for the right in the 1970s and 80s. And you see that in Wisconsin in just the superior and very intelligent organizing of the Bradley Foundation, as they fund certain think tanks and certain organizations. And there's a really good expose in the journal Sentinel right now about the Bradley Foundation's plans to expand to other states, namely Colorado. That was in the journal Sentinel last week or 2 weeks ago. So I mean, the framework they're using in the Midwest is being expanded to the rest of the country, state by state, and it's really impressive stuff.
But I cannot emphasize how enough Matt's original point about the Democratic Party of Wisconsin shooting itself in the foot. I mean, so this last week, for anyone who's familiar with Wisconsin politics, the preeminent question has been who will be challenging Governor Scott Walker in the upcoming gubernatorial election, and Democrats are running scared. There's no one who wants to take that position, but a brave champion has stepped forward. Mayor Paul Soglin, who has been like the face of lefty Madison since the 1960s. I mean, one of his big calling cards is he was involved in the anti-war protests at UW-Madison, and he's been the mayor for life, basically, for the city of Madison over the last few decades. And he's the one who's going to step forward. And you can imagine what Governor Scott Walker's response when he heard that news was. He said, "Bring it on." And this is part of what Corey and Matt are talking about. It's just that there's these retreads and there's a lack of imagination within the Democratic Party to find a different voice that can reach out to voters.
As a personal note, I entered the University of Wisconsin grad school in Paul Glad's recent U.S. seminar with Paul Soglin in the fall of 1966. And another person in that seminar was Tom McCraw, who won the Pulitzer Prize in History in 1985. So he got elected mayor like when he was in his late 20s.
Yeah.
And now he's still mayor.
Yeah.
He wasn't the mayor the whole time. On and
Let me
off.
ask a couple questions.
Are you done?
I'm done.
Got two questions. One directly for Matt, and then the second one is for everybody. Let's start with the second one first for everybody. One of the things Barone talked about this morning is, you know, the 1854 election, establishment of the Republican Party, et cetera. And the number one indicator of what an individual will become in terms of party is what their parents were. And so you mentioned this 100-year plague you're predicting coming down the pipe. But if you look at, you know, what people in Wisconsin are right now and what they're teaching their children to be, I mean, that's a long-term trajectory in perhaps the GOP direction. And I'm just wondering if you find validity to Barone's point about the historical influences on these things. That's for everybody. And then for Matt directly, you mentioned this Alex Jones issue and the conspiracy theories and Hofstadter and the paranoid style and all that comes up. I think maybe there's a regional point to be made here in the sense that the conspiracy theories or the fever swamps seem to be deeper or more intense in the South. And he's from Texas. There's this new book, Nut Country, about Dallas. And when Trump was running in the primaries, I mean, he would win in Alabama and Mississippi by 48 points or something. But in the Midwest, it was the region where he did the worst. I mean, he lost Wisconsin, he lost the Dakotas, he lost Minnesota, Kansas, Ohio, a bunch of them. It was his worst region. So it just seems like those kind of conspiracy theories and stuff are stronger in the South. That might be a regional point you could make if you want to kind of highlight the Midwest.
All right, so two questions. Have at them, guys. You go last, Matt, or you can like answer both. All right. Okay.
I mean, I get in terms of people voting what their parents do, or this kind of cyclical nature. I mean, I'm still looking at a state that yo-yos between, like I said earlier, yo-yos between conservative Republicans and progressive Democrats. So I think I'm seeing right now generations rejecting what their parents are doing and swinging the opposite way. I can't speak as much to the Wisconsin experience. I think there is still some of that yo-yoing going on, but that also has to do with party strength and with the Democrats' ability to put anybody up for election. And we're seeing that right now, that if there isn't a prominent Democrat who can emerge or kind of crawl out of Wisconsin within the next 5-10 years, I think it does it does become a lot more of that gloom and doom that, 100 years of rule or whatnot. It does begin to look a lot like South Dakota, if you will, where one party is predominant, right? And that when Tim Johnson retires, there's nobody waiting in the wings to succeed him. So I think part of that does fall on party to kind of overcome that way in which it's passed down generation to generation.
So the first thing I will say is that I had a number of objections to the plenary speaker's chronology. I'm sure we can talk about that a little bit later, but the one thing I'll say for Latino voters is I don't know what 1854 does for them. There's a number of dates that I think are more important: 1924, 1986, 1994. Those are all kind of touchstones within immigration history. And those dates perhaps influence voters for those who are newer arrivals or who are newer Americans. And so I think it's hard to necessarily judge in the Midwest what that's going to look like for that specific demographic. I could see 2011 being one of those benchmarks for Wisconsin, right? One of those dates that really transforms the electorate and has, kind of like Matt's talking about, generational distinctions, because as there are less families that are union families, there is the possibility that kind of seeps into beyond the 2010s.
Yeah. Are you ready? Another second.
Oh, go for it.
So one thing with that too is that it's even predicting demographic motion is just so tough. You look at, all of a sudden my generation is urbanizing. Wait, some of these people are moving to these ex-urban or rural areas because they want to get back to their roots or whatever. Do we have the rural brain drain, or do we have it being restored in some places? The motion of, I hate myself, the motion of millennials is something that's just going to make it so tough to predict, where are they going to go? What is their student debt going to look like? Are they going to vote with their pocketbook? Again, to call back something like that. So to look at this generation, I think there are just so many of these uncertainties that I stand by my generational thing, but that could totally change. And at the same time, you see if there's this movement within the Democratic Party to recruit or to, I'm thinking of the New York Times article from October that just, I nearly had an aneurysm, the Go Midwest Young Hipster or whatever it was, saying if you want Iowa to turn blue, just move to Iowa. I don't think I've ever been so mad reading something out of the New York Times. Like, yeah, just transplant yourself to Iowa. That'll totally work and change everything. Right. But I think in terms of movement or relocation, I think there are going to be a lot of shoes to drop. On that front. Did I stall all that?
So yeah, I think absolutely, like the paranoid style of American politics has been disproven, but I think it has real political and material currency that I talked about a little earlier, I think before you came in, about the difference between Midwestern businesses and Eastern businesses, and the differences in how they had to address organized labor by the nature of their businesses. And also access to international funding, to shareholders, things like that. And that sort of developed into this rhetorical argument that McCarthy made in terms of how do we get these globalists, how do we get out of the United Nations, how do we return to sovereignty, things like that, and how, sorry, I lost my train of thought on that one. But the other one, the other question, I think, so demographics are kind of changing in the South, and Texas is supposed to be considered a purple state soon, right? And saying, do you think that, you might disagree?
Yeah, we'll get to go ahead.
Okay, all right. And I think if you look at the infrastructural investment that the right is making in the Midwest, it's not a coincidence that Walker, Kasich, and Snyder are all elected in 2011. There's definitely this push to find a new stronghold for conservatives, and I think it's a long-term project that we're just seeing the beginning of now to make the Midwest something for the conservatives.
I've had a bunch of people up here, so we'll go. I've seen 4 hands. I saw 1, 2, 3, 4, so that's kind of we'll do it. Open it up now, rather than me asking some questions. Jason, I saw you first, and Ms. Kirk, and then we'll go on. Yeah.
You guys are doing great work, and this is very impressive. But one way to look at this in Minnesota, Colin Peterson is not just rural, he's pro-life. There's 3 pro-life Democrats in the House. used to be, the Democrats had like 290 members. Then they were pro-life. And that number in the winds was 3 or 4. I mean, think about Colin Peterson in rural Minnesota running, was it 50 points ahead of Hillary? Is that the number you have?
In some precincts.
And that's astonishing. It's not just abortion, that's a human factor. But if the Democrats are serious about this, getting back to majority status, I mean, Nancy Pelosi, who is extremely pro-choice, probably be more pro-choice than she is. But she said, hey, pro-life Democrats, we need them. If we want to keep being the minority for the next 100 years, whatever that strategy really doesn't work. And in Michigan, and Wisconsin, and Iowa, and Minnesota, it doesn't really seem to be working very well. And the Democrats, whoever has a view on this, but the Democrats have ignored that, I think is a mistake.
So I guess since Minnesota's mentioned, that's the whistle for me. With Colin Peterson, I mean, he's in the recent ranking that came out in terms of congressional scores on liberalism. He's something like in the 200s. I mean, he's below dozens of Republicans, I believe, in that overall score. I mean, but you see that debate re-emerging when, for example, to stay in the Midwest in Omaha, when in the mayoral election there, Bernie Sanders came out and endorsed the mayoral Democratic candidate in Omaha, who is pro-life. And pro-life-ish.
Yep.
Pro-life-ish. That's again, but that's still for members and groups within the Democratic Party. Even pro-life-ish is way too much.
Right.
And Bernie got skewered over that issue. So I again historicized by looking at the role of the feminist movement in the late 70s, early 80s with the demise of the ERA. There are just these cracks that started coming into things like the Minnesota DFL Feminist Caucus.
Yeah.
People are leaving that and writing these angry 2-page letters to the rest of the caucus saying, I cannot in good conscience be a part of an organization that is so militantly pro-choice and is making that the #1 issue. It becomes an issue, and I am not a political strategist, I just study it sometimes. Do you hold your nose in some cases if you are one of those liberal Democrats and deal with it, or do you push for ideological purity? That's the debate we keep seeing, and I think the result and what you see on the map here is that in a lot of cases, these rural voters are just rejecting. Or these more conservative Democrats are just saying, we don't want to be told anymore that we have to hold every one of these positions.
In the 90s, Bill Clinton tried to straddle it somewhat. Abortion, rare, safe, and legal. But in 2012, and especially in 2016, it was so explained that, and the media didn't talk about it much, but talking about repealing the Hyde Act, and just no offense and no recognition of unborn children's rights. And then Republicans just, in rural areas and Christian areas, they just made that work. And I mean, it just seems like an extreme strategy. If it fails over and over again, and I get it, most Democrats are pro-choice, but not all of them.
Better be right to win for something.
We got a lot of. So Kurt, let's go to you, and then we'll go here.
Just a quick question, and that is that everybody is talking very detailed about this election, but I'd like to hear your ideas on more first principles and what the Democratic Party stands for today. I mean, what are we talking about? We're talking about how to get precinct, how to get this thing done, how to get these people with signs and all that stuff. That's all low-level stuff, I mean, I know it's your work, but the thing is that, I mean, what are we talking about? I think when you talk about this election, you see very clearly there was a right and a left, and the left was lefter and the right was righter. And so there really was a polarization of the two. You also had personalities. I mean, Clinton may have been an interesting candidate. We're not sure how he's going to govern. But at the same time, we knew everything about her, how she was going to govern, what she was like. We've had her for 25 years. And so that the whole thing with the Democrats seemed to be get a black, which is great, they did well, then get a woman just because she's a woman. I mean, she is Hillary Clinton, and she supposedly had some, well, she had some experience. Didn't all work out, but anyway, the point is that you take for granted the fact that women want women, or something like that, or men are supposed to want women. Otherwise, they get blasted, you see, for not wanting a woman. Well, I voted the opposition. I couldn't believe I could bring myself to vote for Trump. My daughter just disowned me practically. But the fact was only in opposition to Hillary. That was my main thing. Now that may be unusual, but I think I know a lot of people like that.
I'm sorry,
if you
did you
had
say
had
that-
another candidate, it would have been better. And you're going to say, why do I hate
I'm
her?
sorry, no, I was going to ask, you said the left went lefter? I mean, like, are you talking about overall, or are you saying that
Bernie
Hillary
Sanders
Clinton
was
is a
left
shit?
of Hillary.
Okay.
But Bernie
right.
Sanders was not the
Right, but he was not the
candidate.
candidate. So.
Yeah, but he was like the candidate. He had so many people.
But I think this is an
That
important
was
distinction. He did not win the nomination for the Democratic Party. I would not agree that the Democratic Party went left.
He wasn't very happy about it in the beginning. He had to join, and really, you could see. I mean, I had a whole bunch of workers that were helping me that were all for Bernie Sanders.
Uh-huh.
And when that happened, they didn't want to go for her at all. He's a winner. And so that they wanted Bernie. And the young guys, I said, he's so old. And they said, oh, we love Bernie, he's great. And he's gonna cause a revolution. And I said, and then what are you gonna do with the revolution? Well, you know what happened with Frank.
So let's redirect that on the first principles. Again, like what does it mean? Because I think that is really important. And you started with that too, and it is something that Democrats have struggled with for quite a long time to a broader audience. You can talk about it in an academic conference and talk about values that certainly would resonate within most academic audiences. But if you're distilling a political message digestible by the majority in within any state or across the nation, first principles. You guys have an answer for that one? If you did, I suppose you'd be president, but you know.
Yeah, we're running political campaigns, yeah.
Yeah.
We're just historians.
Well, I mean, I pulled up just because I was curious and I wanted to make sure. The swath of, I guess, what I consider the Midwest, especially looking at kind of Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, northern Indiana, northern Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, it's almost overwhelmingly Bernie in the primaries. I mean, by congressional district. I mean, you see it. There's an economic populism to that, and it's an economic, in terms of, in Bernie's case, an economic progressive populism that I identify with. To go back to, again, the drum that I will beat till I die in Minnesota politics, Bernie is Paul Wellstone now that it's cool to be Paul Wellstone. Yeah, he really, this is the same stuff that Paul before his death was saying, and you know, now that it came to the front, I saw these roots of kind of Midwestern economic progressive populism, which is a mouthful, but there's that tradition, which again, I think Boyd is support in 2016.
Yeah, we're there, and then we're going to go.
I have a question for all three of you, and I'm really interested. I think I can in 1 minute do my credentials. I'm old, really old. I've been active for 50 years in local politics here. I was Jerry Ford's county chairman and his district chairman, and I've been active in the party. I have long thought that the move away from party and two individuals, and I thought it 40 years ago was a mistake. I watched this week a liberal and a conservative arguing over the internet, with the liberals saying, well, I don't paint with a broad brush. I try to figure out, you know, who is the best, and I separate some out, and the conservative then backing up, trying to say, well, you know, there's some things I don't like about Trump. What I'm interested in, do you think that the political parties are in a position to pick up strength? Are we at a time where you're going to move back to the? I looked at Ryan Priebus and I couldn't believe him 2 years ago and what he's doing. I mean, whatever you want. That guy knows how to deal, from my perspective, with party. Is there any chance, or are we still going to be, anybody can raise the money and run for president and he can destroy a political party, or is there a movement from the academician's point of view towards political parties?
Yeah. So Previs comes out of this group organized by Michael Greevy, who's the Bradley Foundation chairman. Paul Ryan calls him the godfather of modern American conservatism.
I don't know that. That's good.
Okay, all right.
See, you're the educated ones. And I'm dead serious. I'm just down here laboring in the vineyards.
No, so I mean, I think a lot of people on the right are going back to this party structure where they're putting people, like they're coming up with a program they all agree on, and they're all sticking to the party. I think you see this in the 2011 uprising in Wisconsin, where you have like a unified front basically among the Republicans, where you have the Democrats peeling off a little bit one by one. In the Act 10 vote, I think the Republicans are much more in line and are way ahead, are 50 years ahead of where the Democrats should be. I think on the left, among like our Wisconsin Revolution is a group. Our Revolution is this a group of basically Bernie Sanders' mailing list. They are now starting to take it back to the states, take it to the local level, and trying to build something from the grassroots up, and sort of take over the party at the lower levels, build upward. So I mean, still a long way away. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, right. So you think there is hope for the older system where parties control and did things?
Yeah, that's one.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think it's too soon to say whether or not we're still just a few months outside of the 2016 election. I think it's way too early to say whether this is the death knell of the two-party system. I don't think the Democratic Party can be counted out. Most institutions that have power usually refuse to give it up. And so I don't think individual voters peeling off are going to be the ones on their own that are going to kind of destroy this two-party system. Give it a few years before we make that decision.
I do think, on the other hand, though, is the one time I will participate with you rather than just asking the questions. I do think that my generation, and I'd like to think that I'm your generation, but I'm not. To be clear, it's very obvious to the audience. Is that as compared to the Jerry Ford era, that was an era in which you all believed in institutions.
We did.
And served institutions and believed in those, in absolutes. And that's not the Midwest or the country that my generation grew up with. And I don't think there is that same kind of attachment to big institutions among many groups in my generation, let alone so-called millennials. So I think it is more candidate-centric. It has been really since Theodore Roosevelt. And I think, unfortunately, it will continue in that way. It would be my hunch. I mean, I just really see that if you're able to do what Donald Trump was able to do, and in some states you have a shell of a party, it's hard for people in those states to have faith in their organization, even if they consider themselves to belong to that organization, right? Will Rogers made the joke about not belonging to any organized political party. He was a Democrat. That joke's 100 years old. But that party was way more organized when he made that joke within each state than it is now. I would argue. So anyway, sorry for soapboxing there. But so I would tend to say that I don't see it coming back immediately. That's not to say the Democratic Party will lose out, but I just don't see the party being able to, either party, being able to have the discipline to help choose its candidate, because, right, the Republican Party didn't want Donald Trump to be its candidate. And so unless you really rewrite the party rules, which you could do, but that's going to take some time. And I'm not sure that people who could do that have enough influence right now, would be my long answer. You've had your hand up for a long time,
That's all good.
and we want to hear from you. So,
Sure.
so go ahead.
Well, I'll try to keep this as succinct as possible. So last summer when I was coming back from West Africa, I traveled through Heathrow, through London. I chatted with some NHS, National Healthcare Services workers about Brexit, and they didn't tell me exactly how they voted, but I sensed that they probably came out of labor households, but they didn't see staying in the EU as any better than leaving the EU. And it was that moment I said, Trump could win. And then, dare I say, proud to say, actually I said this to my class the day before the election, I said, never underestimate the power of white supremacy. Never underestimate the power of white supremacy. And I'm intrigued with this conversation, but at the same time I think, and I'm not trying to be a racial essentialist here, but I will say this, and as I'm sure we all know, 90% of African Americans voted for Clinton, including 95% of African American women. Approximately 70% of Latinos voted for Clinton. 53% of white women voted for Trump. Trump won all demographics of white people, including across generations, classes, what have you. I'm also, as you may recall from this morning, this afternoon, born in Michigan, raised in Cleveland. I saw the 1980 election, all those Reagan Democrats, Macomb County, Michigan, the Parma, Ohio. And it seems to me, yes, two things. And I'll say it. Basically, white America, by and large, is an incredibly conservative constituency. And two, the Democrats have failed to come up with some kind of alternative politics that can bring in some people. But going back to Bernie Sanders, what is interesting about this state, Michigan, Bernie won Michigan, and he won the most amount of votes amongst black voters. And lastly, right quick, I heard folks talking about choice and this and all that, pocketbook issues. It seems, and when folks use this term workers and all this and all that, black and brown folks are working class people. They are working people. Many of them are evangelical Christians, pro-choice, but they still voted for Clinton. And again, it seems to me, perhaps at one level, this might be simply a matter of demographics. That we're still at a point where, this is a majority white country. Most white folks, by and large, are conservative. And yes, these issues around, I think, especially in terms of the Midwest, the impact of globalization, the anxieties that has created, and the ways in which white folks have read those anxieties through their own lens of whiteness, helps explain how we have a president, and I'll say this, folks, right, who referred to Mexicans as rapists, talking openly about grabbing women's vaginas, building walls, and this is our president? I mean, so I really, yes, without question, we can critique and should criticize the Democrats, but I think there's something much deeper and pernicious going on within white America, especially in this region.
100% agree with you. This is actually part of my opening statement was.
I missed it. I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's all right. But we should even be more specific though when we talk about Latino voters. But I talked about earlier, right? So 52% of Cubans, Cuban Americans in Florida voted, right? So it's not just these monolithic categories. It's also issues of color, issues of class, right? So Cuban Americans in Florida are predominantly more identify as white, and they are also middle and upper class, right? So some of these pocketbook issues, I think, can be part of the conversation when we talk about race as well within these larger categories. But I completely agree with you because in Wisconsin, 87% of Latinos voted for Hillary Clinton because those questions of immigration, even for Puerto Ricans, even for Central and South Americans who have full documentation status in the United States, saw that as an attack on them, on their identity as Latinos in this country. Yeah.
The one thing I just want to add to that, I think, is consideration of both the Asian vote, both Southeast Asian and Southern and South Asian. I know a lot of hay was made of the whole Indians for Trump movement, and that, I think it's more of an Eastern phenomenon to the best of my recollection. But considering the role of Southeast Asian voters as well, which is I guess for me, Wisconsin and Minnesota being my two kind of stomping grounds. the prevalence or predominance of Hmong communities and other Southeast Asian groups within increasingly suburbanizing St. Paul area, but also looking at Somali voters in Minneapolis. The fact that Ilhan Omar is now a state representative in Minnesota. But looking at where opposition is to these groups, where people have welcomed them, and where these institutions can link up in grassroots organizing. And this is a point that Matt made that I think really needs to be emphasized more, is that there needs to be a dialogue or a conversation begun, and perhaps the Democratic Party can fulfill that role. The fact that, down in somewhere like Austin, Minnesota, that has a meatpacking tradition, that has people of color working, I know a lot of brown working in meatpacking, there aren't conversations. There are not organizations that are linking up white farmers with brown meat packers, with black laborers in the Twin Cities. That's one place where, organizationally speaking, the Republican Party does not have to worry about overcoming that, like you say, but the Democratic Party has to be better about how do we get beyond this sort of identity of black, white, brown, I think, and how do we instead appeal to some sort of laboring class, or appeal to some sort of ideology, some sort of message that you have common skin in the game, that you have some sort of solidarity along class lines, along issues of labor, along where you stand within your communities. How can they build those networks like they usually just had to with various regional or laboring constituencies? Now they've added race into the mix in a bigger way, I think, in the Midwest, and that represents a path to an avenue to success for Midwestern Democrats. If that answers your question.
But that's getting to first principles and articulating them in a clear way that will appeal to a broad base, right? Right? I mean, I think that's what you're saying. They need to articulate that more clearly.
But also, just right quick, but also I think it's important to keep in mind that Republicans too engage in identity politics, right? And
Sure.
so when people of color, we engage in identity politics, but certainly Republicans do, and increasingly in explicit ways, hence all the kind of hate crimes that we've been seeing in the spike in the last year or so. So just a quick response to that, but thank you for your time.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with you. Right after the Brexit vote, that was sort of like a wake-up call for me. And also in the Republican primary, where every single poll kept saying this is the one where he's done, this is his last one, and it never happened. That also happened. I think the one thing that keeps me going is that if you include non-voters, Trump only won like 27% of the electorate. Yeah. So there's room for these parties to grow. They need to tap into these non-voters, which are the largest demographic, and I would have loved to see someone run on a single pair, and just maybe at the state level. Let's see a Wisconsin gubernatorial candidate come out and say, we're going to go for a state level single pair.
I just want to add one more thing on the question of Latinos and immigration. During Trump's campaign, he promised to deport 2 to 3 million what he called criminal illegal aliens, right? That's the term he used. 2 to 3 million. That number should not be surprising to us, because President Obama, in his 8 years in office, deported 2.5 million undocumented people from this country, right? So he, in his presidency, he deported more people in his presidency than all presidents from 1892 to 2000, right? So we cannot make the assumption that the Democratic Party is the home of immigrants. It isn't. And the Clinton campaign had its own stumbles when it came to immigration. Candidate Clinton was using the term illegal up until the end of 2015. Her comments on the Central American refugees, the unaccompanied minors that arrived at the border, were despicable. And we have to be able to disaggregate, even within these campaigns. Sometimes voters are pinching their nose either way in a lot of different ways.
John, you had your hand up for a long time. Do you still want to?
Well, with all this is a great conversation. I don't know. I'm just thinking thinking historically that these political debates constantly keep shifting. You know, what once was very liberal now is kind of, it's like take Al Smith. He was the liberal hope of the Democratic Party in 1924 and 1928. And in 1934, he was in the American Liberty League attacking Roosevelt for going too far, And if you think, okay, who has won the political debates over the 21st century? The liberals or the conservatives. You know, before 1935, there was no Social Security. Before 1965, 64, there was no Medicare and Medicaid and all that. Before, you know, you have to say that the liberals have won most of the battles. We just continue, and you know, a lot of things in society have changed immeasurably. You know, just realities, you know, the wealth of the country. What now is poor used to be kind of rich. Look at the pictures in the 1930s of people's hovels that they lived in. Look where they lived. Well, that was one of my thoughts. But one more thing, and that is the level of political knowledge of the voters. You know, how much do voters actually know? You know, every poll shows that the large majorities of the American population don't even know how many representatives, how many senators there are in their state. So politics becomes largely not the kind of deliberative thing that the founding fathers hoped would. Well, that was a very deferential kind of political, so they didn't even believe in political parties back then. But it becomes, you know, the kind of framing of, you know, George Lakoff was going to teach the Democrats a few years ago how to frame issues and how to you know, use their language the way the Republicans have been so successful at. So is democracy even viable today in a system where most voters, or a lot of voters at least, aren't thinking, we like to think we're the rational thinkers, but that's just.
We have, I think you just asked 5 hours worth.
Well, maybe the rationality thing, you know, we're so good at explaining what happens after an election and why Trump won or why so-and-so won or lost, but we're not so good at predicting what's going to happen tomorrow.
I mean, I got about 15 articles linked, and I know you referenced about 15 articles in your thought piece. People have no clue what the hell happened still. I mean, that's you'll get one that's for working class, one it's racism, one it's regionalism. I mean, there are so many different things out there. About what it was in terms of these seminal or defining moments where you look at orders that are established for future generations to come, and one that Matt talked about. One of the things that I look at as cleaving a major marker that I conveniently not extend to my dissertation to deal with is NAFTA. And that you see that, especially in this anti-globalism crusade, a lot of these Midwestern voters have felt left behind by NAFTA. And so we look at the positive, you know, we talk about things like Social Security, about Medicare, as these positive seminal moments. There are plenty of people looking at NAFTA in '93 as this positive seminal moment and incorporating the U.S. into the world. And now we're seeing this reaction back against that. We could talk about, you know, fast forward 20 years, we could talk about Obamacare in a very similar way. So I think that's, again, historical. We need time, you know, as historians, we need time for things to kind of shake out before we feel comfortable edging out of that limb. But I think that might be one of those seminal moments that you mentioned.
The one thing I'll say, you mentioned Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid. I think we'd all agree it's a lot harder to take away entitlements once they've already been given. I think we're seeing this with Obamacare, with the healthcare debates today. So I don't know if I necessarily agree with liberals have won the day over the 20th century. It's just that it's really hard to pull those things off the table once they've already been thrown out there.
In terms of how those are funded too, I mean, that gets to the new, is it Cowie or Salvatore? It must have been Jefferson Cowie who has the book on the Great Exception.
Yeah.
You know, is it the Great Exception? Do we buy that argument instead? So I think that's still, we're still fighting that out.
So a bunch of, I'm going to go here because we haven't heard from a question from you first. We're getting close on time, so I want to make sure we respect that.
Yeah, be quick here. This is kind of a point that you opened up with Sergio about trying to overcome monolithic categories. And one thing that I'm trying to ask here is about how to address, I mean, this whole idea that there's rural and urban throughout the United States or in the Midwest, but the Midwest is dominantly urban now in the 21st century. So I'm wondering how you guys see that influencing this past election. I think, Corey, you've been kind of on it, talking about suburbs and exurbs and things like that. So maybe to expand on that and what to do to kind of overcome this agrarian myth kind of rule, as we talked about Hofstadter earlier, kind of in the 21st century. So.
Okay, well, I mean, what do we, since you brought up the rural-urban kind of that binary again, we haven't mentioned her yet. We have to talk about Kathy Kramer at some point, right? We're going to talk about Wisconsin. Politics of Rural Resentment being a book. If you haven't read it, go read it. It's very, very good. And what I try to do in my research is actually historicize that. How have we, in Wisconsin, developed something? Oh, I do have one more map, sorry.
Yeah, right.
How have we in Wisconsin developed, I say we have Minnesota, and I take that all back, I'm not a Wisconsin. But how have we developed and gone from, I want to do that. How have we gone from this? This is Russ Feingold's victory in,
Should say that? Yeah.
in 1992. So you can see it's not entirely, the shading is a little bit off, but you can see he's winning these big swaths of the state that are relatively rural or ex-urban for these very ones that are close to Minneapolis. He's winning rural and ex-urban areas. And we fast forward. I mean, that's a colorblind person can tell that's a stark change, right? So it's looking at some of these binaries. Where have these emerged? How have parties, and I don't want to say let them get that way, because that's as much as Dr. McDuffie points out, it's as much effort on the Republican Party's behalf, and like Matt talks about, it's as much Republican effort as it is Democratic, I don't know, laziness, inability, incompetence, especially in Wisconsin, we've talked about Democratic incompetence. But that's something that I think we're, you know, as graduate students, we're all seeking to historicize in our research and kind of explain how we got here.
Well, I think you're talking about like the Wisconsin idea as well, this idea of a mutual partnership between the universities and their constituencies, and how I think Kathy Kramer goes on to like, well, what's going on? What are these other people doing? It's like, what, I think she should also be looking at what the university is not doing anymore, and that it's not addressing necessarily the needs of Wisconsin voters as they think they should. So like, I mean, it used to be like you had a very strong UW extension program that would go out into the farms and actually like help with actual like tangible material issues. That has sort of gone wayside. And I think there's this resentment now that because they're paying taxes to this university, even though it's not nearly what they think it is. The amount I think it is. I think UW-Madison is only like 13% taxpayer funded anymore. But it's this this anger that against Milwaukee-Madison, based on not what they see as not a mutual relationship anymore.
And the one of the complicating factors for the rural-urban divide, I think, is these new communities, like Latino communities. So I'll give you some numbers here. I was on a panel earlier in the morning where we talked about Latino immigration throughout the Midwest, and one of our panelists discussed Green Bay as kind of a place where there's been a growing Latino community. So in 1990, there were 1,500 Latinos in Brown County. In 2014, there were 21,000 Latinos in Brown County, right? So Trempealeau County, which is borders along the Wisconsin-Minnesota border. In 1990, there were 53 Latinos in Trempealeau County, 53. In 2014, there were 2,000 Latinos, right? So imagine what that does to rural, so you have a place like Brown County with city of Green Bay, which is not a very large city. What does that large, very sudden migration and growth of Latino communities do to a place like Green Bay or a place like Trempealeau County? And I don't know the answer to that. We'll see if that anti-sanctuary bill that I talked about, if it actually makes it through the Assembly and the Senate and pass the governor's desk this time around. But that is going to, I think, also affect the way we think about the rural-urban divide, is when Latinos are not just in Madison and they're not just in Milwaukee, but they're just exploding in places that they weren't before.
I want to address that one in terms of another community being Hmong Americans moving to cities like Wausau, Wisconsin, which is where in Minnesota they settle in Minneapolis-St. Paul. And that's overgeneralizing. I'm sorry to my Hmong friends who won't watch this video, but anyways. But they settle in Minneapolis-St. Paul, that's it. In Wisconsin, they go to these exurban places like Wausau, like Eau Claire, like La Crosse. And especially in places like Wausau, where this coincides with the decline of with logging and with declining industry, we know what happened. They are the scapegoat for those things. So this is a similar trend that needs to be explored better in places. And then these communities then, like we talked about with rural resentment and with urban resentment, they turn that at the metropole. They turn that at Madison and Milwaukee. That's why you see Lee Dreyfus in 1978 run partially on the quote, the pithy quote of Madison is 30 square miles surrounded by reality. And that's they don't say it outright anymore, but Republican politicians in Wisconsin run on that platform. In 1996, they're trying to raise funds for Miller Park in Milwaukee, the baseball stadium. Tommy Thompson, I think it's in Wausau, but I could be wrong, goes and literally tells the voters who are voting on a sales tax that would apply only to Milwaukee and neighboring Waukesha County to stick it to Milwaukee. That is his exact words, to vote for a state tax. These are, I mean, and Scott Walker, incidentally, is one of the people who voted for that tax. So you look at these politics of resentment, and it is really an us versus them thing that is played off very, very well by Republican organizers, especially in rural areas, who are able to turn that on urban areas.
Matt, I'm glad you brought up the role of the universities, because I think in my reading of Kathy Kramer is like she could play that up even more, right? Is that especially in the Midwest, that these flagship institutions aren't doing what they once did to connect average people to education. That's partly due to funding. There are a lot of explanations, right? And in some ways, I think also maybe even the rise of a lot of the branch campuses also takes away from this idea that the flagship serves the entirety of the state, right? And that's true throughout many of these states in the Midwest, where if you're from somewhere in rural Ohio, you're not getting into Ohio State. And so you have no, other than the football team, which trumps all, I'm a native Ohioan, other than that, you have no buy-in to the mission of the university, and the mission of the university isn't tied to the people in those rural communities. So to some people, they look at all the land in Madison, in Champaign-Urbana, but especially in Columbus, other places, say, why do you have these farms here? This is wasted space, and it's the core of the mission of the university, right? The land grant part of it. So I think that that's a part of it where people see that as a relic and see that as an anachronism, rather than as a continuing mission of what has been a really distinguishing hallmark of the Midwest more than any other region, right? And so are you guys familiar with people who are writing on that? I'm sure that people are. But I feel like that's a...
Not really.
No, I mean, no is the short answer. In terms of some engagement of it, just with, again, Big Ten football. I mean, I'm a Northwestern graduate,
right.
So I have no attach, nobody has any reason to attach themselves. Yeah, you saw what happened in Iowa City last year. But this idea that, I mean, even the idea that these are land grant schools is lost. That, you know, that Michigan State and Penn State still play for that ugly bowling trophy that's called the land grant trophy. Nobody engages with why the hell it's called the land grant trophy. There's no historicism of some of these cultural, I don't want to call the land grant trophy an icon, but some of these cultural icons that are so central to these seminal things in Midwestern culture.
And I will just say one last thing on this is it's a nasty cycle that starts to eat upon itself, right? So when the state continues to defund public universities, public administrators are forced to make funding decisions, right? So we've seen this at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where the number of out-of-state students has risen because state legislators have a frozen tuition, right? So the chancellor says she feels her hands are tied and she needs to look for funding from other sources. And this helps kind of within the state feel like my kid is not going to get into this university because somebody from Chicago or somewhere else is going to get in instead of me.
Right, and then maybe even targeting different minority groups too, right? It's like people like me, and that's kind of Kathy spoke too, people like me aren't getting to go to this university. The university does not serve people like me, and then you can other in many different ways. Go ahead.
And I think the one division we've seen in the Republican Party of Wisconsin is over this issue of funding these universities. It's Steve Nass has been one of Walker's right-hand men. He has basically ran his campaign on his disdain for University of Wisconsin-Madison, saying we don't need classes that teach the ancient mating habits of whatever, is one of his famous quotes. But he actually, when Walker used one of his education budgets to cut UW lacrosse funding and all the other schools, he actually got such a pushback from his constituents that he came out and he freaked out, and they actually put money back in the budget. So I mean, this is public education in the state is one issue I think we can exploit among Wisconsin Republicans if you're a Democrat.
We are really.
It's just a comment.
Okay.
I just want everyone to know here who's writing about politics. There's a new book on post-World War II politics of the Midwest It's being assembled now, so there's a call for chapter proposals out there on the table, so.
Due September 1st or August 1st, something like that, one of those two.
Somewhere in there.
So definitely for everybody in the audience, make sure you participate. We are right up at 5:15. Continue this conversation at the reception and otherwise. It's been a real privilege for me as somebody who's at a smaller school to be up here with really talented graduate students to think through some of these pressing issues. I think it's a testament to the work that they're doing and what the Midwestern History Association is trying to do as an emerging organization. And so I think it's really important to support graduate students, and I want to thank the audience in particular at the end of the day for participating with people whose names you might have not known on the face of looking at the panel, but realizing they had something important to say. So thanks to everybody here. Thanks especially to my panelists who did a great job. And again, Howland Center for putting on just a tremendous conference. So let's enjoy